And let me say once again, this is not our war. We will not be drawn into the conflict. That is not in our national interest. And the most effective way we can support the cost of living in Britain is to push for de-escalation in the Middle East and a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which is such a vital route for energy. To that end, we're exploring each and every diplomatic avenue that is available to us. The Foreign Secretary and the Chancellor have met their counterparts in the G7. The Defence Secretary has been in the Middle East speaking to our partners. And the UK has now brought together 35 nations around our statement of intent to push as one for maritime security across the Gulf. And today I can announce that later this week, the Foreign Secretary will host a meeting that brings those nations together for the first time, where we will assess all viable diplomatic and political measures that we can take to restore freedom of navigation, guarantee the safety of trapped ships and seafarers, and resume the movement of vital commodities. Following that meeting, we will also convene our military planners to look at how we can marshal our capabilities and make the Strait accessible and safe after the fighting has stopped. Because I do have to level with people on this. This will not be easy. I spoke with relevant business leaders in shipping, finance, insurance, and energy supply in Downing Street on Monday. And they were clear with me the primary challenge they face is not one of insurance, but one of safety and security of passage. So the fact is, we need all of this together. A united front of military strength and diplomatic activity, partnership with industry, so they too can mobilise once the fighting has stopped. And above all, clear and calm leadership. That is what this country is ready to provide. Because my guide from the start of this conflict has always been the British national interest. And freedom of navigation in the Middle East is in the British national interest. Let me turn now to the impact at home, because I know that this is causing huge concern. People turn on their television, they look at their screens, they say explosions, infrastructure blown up, aggressive rhetoric. They worry that the UK will be dragged into this. We won't. But I also know that people have a deep sense that this will affect their family and their household. They can see it at the petrol pumps, and they worry about their energy bills. It is the job of government to meet these moments, not just with immediate action, but also with clarity about our direction. That's what I remember about the 1970s, when my family could not pay every bill. We struggled through the energy shocks and the price rises of that decade. But we always believed in the end that Britain would secure a better future for us. And I think that's what's been lacking in the crises of recent years. And I'm not prepared to ask the British people once again to go through a crisis, come out of it, and say, business as usual, back to the status quo. So on our economy, on our energy, and on our defence, this time will be different. We will make Britain a fairer and more secure country, because that hope is what is needed as the country comes together, and because how we emerge from this crisis will define us for a generation. So, as I set out a few weeks ago, we have a 5-point plan for the immediate crisis. We're cutting energy bills by over £100 per household today. We've extended the cut in fuel duty until September, and we're monitoring that situation daily. We're supporting people exposed to heating oil rises, setting aside £53 million for that. We're taking back control of our energy security by investing in clean British energy, because that is the only way we get your bills off the roller coaster that is controlled by Putin and the Iranian regime. And frankly, I'm sick and tired of your energy bills fluctuating up and down because we're on the international market, when if we took control of our energy and had homegrown renewables, we could stabilise your bills. And finally, as I say, we'll continue to push for de-escalation in the Middle East. But look, there's also a bigger argument here, because every one of these measures is part of a long-term plan to make our country more secure and more resilient to shocks like this. I mean, just look at what's happening today. Today, your energy bills will be cut because of the action that we took at the budget. And whatever happens in Iran, that price is now fixed until July. Today, if you need a prescription, instead of rising as they used to, the price will be frozen for a year. Today, if you're working on the national living wage, your wages will go up. Next week, on Monday, the state pension will go up. Next week, the two-child limit will be scrapped, lifting 450,000 children out of poverty, the vast majority from working households. And next week, the biggest strengthening of workers' rights in a generation will become law, a huge boost to the economic security of working people. Now, some people may say, this isn't new, this was already planned, to which I say, yes, that is my point. Everything I've done in politics, certainly since the Ukraine war in 2022, is a response to this new and dangerous world. We campaigned for a windfall tax on oil and gas companies, which we extended. We focused on the cost of living, and we acted at the budget. And we've always emphasised the need for clean British energy. And we've invested because we knew that making our country secure in this world was the ultimate test that we would face and our ultimate responsibility to the British people. Now, it's not going to be easy, clearly. And in the coming weeks, as you would expect, we will continue to assess the economic effects. We will continue to stand up for the British national interest. And we will continue to do what we must to guide our country calmly through this storm. However, it is increasingly clear that as the world continues down this volatile path, our long-term national interest requires closer partnership with our allies in Europe and with the European Union. Now we have made progress on this front, on agriculture, electricity, emissions trading, and more. But as the Chancellor has rightly pointed out, Brexit did deep damage to our economy, and the opportunities to strengthen our security and cut the cost of living are simply too big to ignore. So, in the coming weeks, we will announce a new summit with our EU partners. And I can tell you that at that summit, the UK will not just ratify existing commitments made at last year's summit. We want to be more ambitious. Closer economic cooperation, closer security cooperation, a partnership that recognises our shared values, our shared interest, and our shared future. A partnership for the dangerous world that we must navigate together. A world where this government will be guided at all times by the interests of the British people. Thank you. I will now take questions, and I have the BBC first. Henry.
Thank you, Prime Minister. As it stands, fuel duty is set to go up in September. You've said that's under review. I think today you said you were monitoring it. It is very hard to find anyone here in Westminster who seriously believes that you are going to press ahead with that. So if today was about reassurance, why don't you just give motorists that little bit of reassurance now and tell them it's not going to go up?
Well, fuel duty is set until September, as you rightly say, in terms of the cut. That will remain the position. The other measures that we're taking today, obviously energy bills are going down today, on average by £100 a household, and that will remain down until the end of June, whatever happens in the conflict. And I know people are concerned to know that that remains the case, whatever happens in the conflict. So let me be clear about that. And those that are heating their homes with oil are obviously getting support. We are keeping this under review. Obviously, a lot will depend on how long the conflict goes on, how quickly the Strait of Hormuz can be opened. And that's why I've made the statement I have today about the next step that we're taking, particularly on the Strait of Hormuz, which will be crucial in terms of what actually happens to energy prices and how long there's a spike in those prices. So that's the action that we're taking today. I've got ITV, Harry. Harry.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Harry Houghton from ITV News. President Trump has said this morning that he's considering pulling the US out of NATO. You've just talked about looking at a new long-term partnership with the EU, including on security. Is this an acknowledgement that Britain's long-term security relationship with the United States is about to change?
Well, let me say a number of things in response to that. Firstly, NATO is the single most effective military alliance the world has ever seen. And it has kept us safe for many decades, and we are fully committed to NATO. Secondly, that whatever the pressure on me and others, whatever the noise, I'm going to act in the British national interest in all the decisions that I make. And that's why I've been absolutely clear that this is not our war, and we're not going to get dragged into it. But I'm equally clear that when it comes to defence and security and our economic future, we have to have closer ties with Europe. That's why we had the summit last year. This year, as I've just announced, there'll be a further summit. We will make good on the commitments that we put in place last year, but we will also go further in relation to the alignment. Thank you very much, Harry. I've got Lucy from Sky. Lucy.
Thank you. Prime Minister, you're talking here, of course, today about the cost of living. You said yourself, nothing in this speech is new. You've got the Australian Prime Minister earlier talking about slashing tax on petrol and diesel, telling people not to use more than they need. Can you be really clear to people at home listening to this, should they be looking at changing their behaviours now? Well,
in terms of the situation, we're monitoring it carefully. We had a Cobra meeting looking at the ongoing impacts here in Britain yesterday. That is being monitored daily. I had the business sector in on Monday to discuss with them, this was shipping, finance, insurance, to discuss with them mainly how we deal with the Strait of Hormuz, how quickly we can get action there to get the supply open or fully open. And that is what we are doing. They're decisions that we think are right here, and we will continue to do that. But I emphasise, again, it's clear to me that the main determinant now of the impact is going to be how long the conflict goes on, and the question of how quickly we can get safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. And the two don't necessarily go together. In other words, I don't think it can necessarily be assumed that a de-escalation of the conflict necessarily at the same time brings the full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and that's why we're moving to the next level of planning in relation to the Strait of Hormuz. We've been dealing with this for some time, but now we move to the next stage with the Foreign Secretary meeting coming up later this week, the first time we've convened that coalition, if you like, of countries to look at diplomatic means, political means, and then the military planners coming together at a separate meeting to look at capabilities. Thank you very much, Andy. And I should say, Andy, congratulations to your daughter on the gold medal, I think, that she's just got.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, actually following on partly from Lucy's question, I mean, in other parts of the world, there is much more of a sense of leaders preparing their populations to say, this is hard, you may have to do things differently. Yet from your government so far, we've heard behave as normal, even book your summer holidays as normal. Isn't it time maybe to address the British people and say, perhaps we have to start thinking about our behaviour in a different way?
Well, a number of points in response to that. Firstly, there are a number of measures we're taking. The direct measures in relation to energy price, the support for oil, fuel duty. The wider measures, most of which come in either today or this week on the cost of living, which are not a response to this particular conflict, but are a response to the fact that the cost of living has been the number one issue in our country for a very long time. And I'm conscious that whatever's going on in the world, whatever's going on in politics, that remains the number one issue. In relation to the situation, we are monitoring it very carefully on a daily basis. Our assessment it looks at supply, looks at the impact on our economy, and we'll keep the measures we've got in place at the moment. I'm absolutely convinced that the most important thing is de-escalation. The most important thing is getting the Strait of Hormuz back fully open, and that's why we're putting a lot of effort into the next stage of that and really pushing forward. And as I've said, we're prepared to take a sort of leadership role in that as the United Kingdom in relation to the Straits of Hormuz. Thank you, Andy. I've got Paul from Channel 4. Paul.
Morning, Prime Minister. Look, most of the measures you're talking about were already in place before this war kicked off. So far, you seem reluctant to talk about specifics for help because of this war. And the criticism is that you've been dithering. So have you been dithering, or yes or no, do you have in mind a fixed set of plans for the hardest hit by the cost of living crisis caused by this war? And if so, when can we expect to hear them? What are the key indicators that will make you say, this is what we've got planned for you?
Yeah, let me just answer that. Firstly, a lot of the measures on the cost of living were measures that were taken at the budget last year, so we were ahead of this. Most people will be watching on their screens, worried about the damage they're seeing, the explosions they're seeing, the conflict, but they will also have this deep feeling inside, this could affect me. And what they mean by that is it could have an effect on the cost of living. We've been saying the cost of living is the single number one issue for a very long time. So it's not a coincidence that the measures coming into force today are on the cost of living, because I've been clear that that is the central issue, and that is I think for most people in the country, that's the thing they're probably worrying most about today. So we're actually ahead of the game in relation to that, because we took those measures at the budget. The only reason energy bills are coming down today by an average of £100 is because of the measures that we took at the budget, and they'll be down for 3 months. So those measures have been taken. In relation to what might be needed later in the year, obviously we're working through contingencies. A lot of it will depend on how long the conflict goes on, how quickly the straits are open, because it's very difficult to assess at the moment what might be needed, say, in the winter, until we know the answer to that question. So we're looking at a number of contingencies, as you would expect. I think it's important to point out that whilst there will always be a concern about energy bills, I think people will begin to really worry when it gets to the autumn energy bill, because the summer bill, which is the next one, tends to be, on average, about 7% of the energy people use. It doesn't mean they're not worried about it, but I think most people will be looking to what's the one that comes when it gets colder later in the year. So we're working across all of that. But in the end, the focus has to be on de-escalation and getting the strait open. And that begins to answer the question of what is the nature of any support that may be needed. Clearly, we want to make sure that we act for everybody in keeping the price down, the cost down. And today's measure on energy bills is a measure for everyone. But equally, in terms of tailoring support, we need to make sure that nobody is left behind here. Thank you very much, Paul. Natasha from LBC. Natasha.
Natasha Clark from LBC. The head of the House Oversight Committee, which is investigating the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein, has called on the King to meet those victims. Do you think there is a